A gentle breeze brushed against the golden leaves as Ethan sat alone on the park bench, clutching an old worn envelope in his trembling hands. The world moved around him, yet he was frozen in time, consumed by the weight of his loss. Just a few weeks ago, his mother, Clara, had been his entire world, a single mom who worked tirelessly to give him everything, even at the cost of her own dreams. But now she was gone, and the house felt emptier than ever. Ethan had always known his mom was hiding something, but he never pressed her. She'd often disappear into her room late at night, only to emerge with red eyes and a weary smile. Now he had an answer, or so he thought. After her funeral, Ethan discovered a box tucked away in the attic, filled with letters addressed to him. Letters she'd written in her final days. Each envelope carried a piece of her soul, her love, and her advice for the future. But one letter stood out. It wasn't like the others. The handwriting was shaky, and the date was impossible, written a week after her death. The message inside was hauntingly personal, as if she had been watching him from beyond. She spoke of a dream where he was lost, searching for her in the woods, crying out for help. She begged him to let go of the guilt that was consuming him and to trust that she was still with him, in a way he'd never understand. As Ethan read the words, his chest tightened. How could she have known? And why did the dream feel so familiar? He didn't believe in signs, but what happened next would change everything. Ethan couldn't shake the eerie feeling the letter gave him. The dream his mother described wasn't just words on paper. It felt real, like a memory buried deep in his mind. He remembered nights waking up drenched in sweat, hearing faint whispers, and feeling an overwhelming sense of being watched. But he had always dismissed it as grief playing tricks on him. Now he wasn't so sure. The letter had more to say, urging Ethan to visit the woods behind their old home, an area he hadn't stepped foot in since childhood. Clara had taken him there once, years ago, pointing out the tall oaks and the hidden stream. She'd called it a place of peace where she went to think and pray. But something about her tone that day had unsettled him. She'd seemed distant, her eyes fixed on the horizon as if she were searching for something. Or someone. Ethan tried to push it all aside, convincing himself that the letter was just his mom's way of comforting him, but deep down, he felt a pull he couldn't explain. The woods had always been a place he avoided, especially after his father disappeared. Clara never spoke much about his dad, only that he'd left one day and never returned. But now, as Ethan reread the letter, a strange connection began forming in his mind. Could the woods hold answers to more than just his mother's message? He didn't know what he'd find there, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that it was calling him, just like she had said. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. The letter sat on his bedside table, its words etched into his mind. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside felt amplified, as if the universe was urging him to act. Against his better judgment, he grabbed a flashlight and his jacket. The woods were only a short walk from the house, but each step felt heavier than the last, his heart pounding in his chest. As he reached the tree line, a strange sense of familiarity washed over him. The air was colder here, the silence almost deafening. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Memories of his childhood resurfaced. The way his mother had always avoided talking about the woods after his father disappeared. The few times he'd asked, she would change the subject or tell him he was too young to understand. The deeper Ethan walked, the more he noticed things that felt out of place. Twisted branches forming strange patterns, faint markings carved into tree trunks, and a faint humming sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. He stopped suddenly, his flashlight catching the outline of something in the distance. It was a small clearing, illuminated by the moonlight. In the center stood an old wooden bench, weathered and cracked, just like the one in his mother's favorite park. Ethan approached cautiously, his breath visible in the icy air. On the bench lay another letter, addressed to him. His hands trembled as he reached for it, a single question echoing in his mind. Who left this here? Ethan's fingers hesitated over the envelope. The air around him felt heavy, almost pressing against his chest. Slowly he unfolded the letter, its paper brittle and damp from the cold. The handwriting was the same, his mother's unmistakable script, but the words sent a chill down his spine. You're closer than you think. Trust your heart, not your fear. Everything you've been searching for is here." A sudden rustling sound broke the silence, and Ethan spun around, his flashlight trembling in his grip. Shadows seemed to dance between the trees, but every time he focused, they vanished. He felt a presence, something just out of sight, watching, waiting. His heart raced as the humming sound grew louder, almost like a whisper in his ears, calling his name. In the clearing, the wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of his mother's favorite perfume. Ethan's eyes widened as he noticed faint footprints in the frosty grass, leading deeper into the woods. They weren't his. Against his instincts, he followed them, every step feeling heavier, like the ground itself was pulling him down. The trail ended at a massive oak tree, its bark etched with symbols he didn't recognize. At its base lay an old locket, one he hadn't seen in years. It belonged to his father. Ethan picked it up, his breath caught in his throat. As he opened it, the humming stopped abruptly, replaced by a voice behind him, a voice he hadn't heard in years. "Ethan, you shouldn't have come here." Ethan's blood ran cold as the voice echoed in the night air. He spun around, but no one was there. The clearing was still, the trees standing like silent sentinels, their shadows stretched long in the moonlight. His pulse thundered in his ears, the locket clutched tightly in his hand. He was certain he'd heard it, his father's voice, a voice he had forgotten, buried in the corners of his mind. "Who's there?" Ethan called out, his voice shaking. No answer, only the rustling of leaves. He looked down at the locket again, his mind racing. How could his father's voice be here now? The man who had vanished without a trace so many years ago? Suddenly the ground beneath him shifted. He staggered back as a low growl echoed from the trees. A shadow moved, too fast for him to track. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The humming sound returned, louder now, filled with an eerie familiarity, as if the forest itself was alive, feeding off his fear. Then from the darkness, a figure emerged, a tall, shadowy figure, with eyes that glowed unnaturally bright. Its form was vague, almost shifting, like a mirage in the night. As it took a step closer, Ethan's heart stopped. The figure was wearing his mother's old scarf, the one she used to wear when they go on walks together. But it wasn't his mother. It was something else, something worse. "You're not ready to know," the voice said again, but this time it was no longer familiar. It was cold, hollow, like it came from the depths of the earth itself. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he took a step back, the locket still tight in his hand. His mind screamed for him to run, but he couldn't move. The air felt thick, suffocating. The glowing eyes of the figure locked onto his, and for a moment he could see it clearly, an image of his mother's face, but twisted, contorted in pain, her eyes hollow. "Mom?" Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand, its fingers long and bony, reaching toward him. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath him, and the forest seemed to come alive. The trees groaned as if in agony, the shadows around them shifting in strange, unnatural patterns. The humming sound reached a deafening crescendo, a mix of his mother's voice and something darker, something ancient. Then the figure spoke again, but this time its voice was not hollow. It was clear, sharp, filled with a chilling finality. "You've been searching for answers, Ethan, but the truth was always here, in your blood." With those words, the figure lunged, but before it could reach him, a sharp light flashed from the locket in his hand. The figure screeched, stumbling back as if struck by a powerful force. Ethan's vision blurred, and in that instant, the truth hit him like a wave. The locket was his father's, but it had belonged to something far older. His father had never left. He had become part of something darker, something that had been waiting for Ethan. The last thing Ethan saw before everything went black was the figure's final words. "It's too late. You've already joined us." When Ethan opened his eyes again, he was no longer in the woods. The cold, haunting air was replaced by a heavy warmth, a quiet stillness that felt unnatural. He sat up, disoriented, and found himself in a small, dimly lit room. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, but it wasn't her comforting tone. It was filled with sorrow, almost as if she were apologizing for something. The room was bare except for a single old mirror mounted on the wall. As Ethan stood up and approached it, the reflection staring back at him wasn't his own. The face in the mirror was older, worn, and familiar. It was his father's. But the eyes weren't his. They were hollow, empty, just like the figure in the woods. "Where am I?" Ethan's voice cracked as he whispered the question aloud. The reflection of his father smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was dark, twisted. "You're here," the reflection replied. "With us." Suddenly, the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. His father hadn't disappeared all those years ago. He had been part of something far worse. Ethan's bloodline had always been tied to this darkness, a curse that ran deeper than he could ever understand. His mother had tried to protect him, but she had been trapped by it too, just like him. As he stepped back from the mirror, the world around him shifted again, the room dissolving into mist. The last thing Ethan felt before everything faded was the weight of the locket in his hand, its warmth spreading through his veins. And then, the silence. The cycle was complete.